Hi, I'm Angela Kelley. I'm Director of Sound Choices Coalition. When we talk about research into this subject, this is something I've researched extensively, but also so have other people. This right here is a 300-page decision from the Canada polygamy case from 2011. What is most startling about this decision is that everyone expected Canada to legalize polygamy. They were the fourth country to legalize gay marriage. And recently, prior to this decision, they had decriminalized bestiality. When this came before the court, they thought that they would legalize it. And looking at from the outside, realizing what a liberal country Canada is, anyone would have thought the same thing. This decision says has a different answer than what Senator Henderson has come up with. There's two aspects in polygamy that do not exist in monogamy, and one of them Easton touched on, and that is that women become a commodity. The reason they become a commodity is because men and women are born in a 1-to-1 ratio, no matter where you go, unless you're in China or you're in a war-ravaged country. I actually did the math on this. I'm happy to share my spreadsheet with you. I wanted to know how many boys were displaced. How many boys are either forced out or how many will eventually leave on their own? And when you just take the minimum of 3 wives, 66% of your boys will have to be kicked out. So my concern with lowering it, even though I understand all the points, I get it, and I'm grateful that you want to help victims. But I don't see how this bill takes away any of these types of things. This is in a statement from Cherished Families.
Go ahead.
But what little is known to the outside world is the unremittent indoctrination of women to be submissive, subservient, and silent. This training starts at birth and continues through a young girl's life, often culminating in an arranged marriage and a command to go forth and multiply. To me, that doesn't sound like the fear is coming from outside. What holds polygamy together, this is what the Canada case found, this is what they found across the world. France is currently dealing with it, Israel is dealing with it. What holds polygamy in place, no matter where you are, whether it's religious or not, is power and control. And power and control is, there's this nice little diagram of a power and control wheel. And the tactics that are used, you should be familiar with this wheel. I took apart the primer, which is this document here that our Attorney General's office published on how to handle plural families. And as I read it, they were telling me they didn't believe in domestic violence or power and control, and I was like, wait a minute, like all these things that you're admitting to have to do with power and control and coercion. It's what blood atonement is. It's what when they banish, when they're reassigning families, they're reassigning children, they're telling mothers their children don't belong to them. That has nothing to do with the government on the outside. And I'm just curious, I have to ask myself, why did Canada, it would have made sense for them to legalize it, why did they come to a different conclusion?
Ms. Kelley, I've got a couple questions from the committee for you. So we'll first go to Senator Cullimore.
Thank you, Ms. Kelley. The difficulty thing about these types of bills is at the end game, I think everybody's pretty much unified in what the end results would be, right? We're here
Correct.
to protect the victims. So in opposing this bill, are you suggesting, or is it your opinion that prosecutors should be more actively prosecuting those in violation of the law currently?
That's a difficult question to answer because I do believe there are many good polygamist families. What we have to realize with polygamy is it really is organized crime. There's a reason why it was compared to slavery, and that is that when slavery existed in America, very few Americans owned slaves. It was plantation owners that owned slaves. There was very few, considering how many slaves there were. There was over 3 million slaves. And the same thing is existing in polygamy. It is an economic system. The people at the top are the ones benefiting off the backs of everybody else in this, a united order, giving everything to the group type mentality. So it's a difficult question. At this point, Utah's the one who hasn't upheld their end of the bargain with statehood. And it was actually something that the United States worried about. I've read every single congressional record hearing on it. And they were concerned that, okay, we're going to have it criminalized, but then you're going to leave it to Utah to enforce the law? And what everything I read, it didn't have anything to do with marginalizing people from a religion. That was the most shocking part of reading the documents. When I read them, I read statements from legislators across the country saying, how do we help them realize what this leads to? It doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't lead to good. You can't build a society on it. So my fear is, yeah, the greater, she makes it stricter in the end of it, but bring it down to an infraction, you are essentially saying this is an okay lifestyle. And it might be for 10 people, but we're talking about society as a whole. And another thing the Canada case showed is that the propensity for people to live polygamy, if they're allowed, it actually goes in that direction.
Okay, we're going to go to Senator Escamilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Kelley, thank you.
Yes.
So question, part of your presentation mentioned the many countries that
Yes.
are facing the
Yes.
same questions. So this is clearly not a Utah problem. So
It's
I want
not
to
a
start
Utah
that
problem.
because
You're correct.
You're like shifting here. I want you to tell me per line if you can help me because we're right now discussing first substitute SB102.
Yes.
I'm not, we can have lectures on issues related to polygamy.
I'm just trying to help you
So,
understand.
Like I said, I've worked that field before with domestic violence survivors. I want to understand in the lines of the bill what your problem is. Like exactly where you think
Well-
we are legalizing bigamy or
You are
polygamy.
decriminalizing it.
Correct.
You are making it an infraction, right? The very first level is an infraction.
Correct.
So, if we want to have semantics, we're technically not even dealing with bigamy, honestly. We're dealing with polygamy. No one in Utah is practicing bigamy because bigamy means it's a legal marriage. So technically, none of this even makes sense because they're not legal marriages. Technically, we're dealing with polygamy, right? So, but because it is defined this way here, right? My fear is you want to make it an infraction, the very practice of it. That's dangerous because you can't have that go out into society. It's like people want to think that, well, if you do this, it's only going to affect the different groups, right? It's only going to affect the FLDS or the Kingstons or even the independents. No one else is going to want to do this. But that's not what history says. History says you will encourage others to live this way. That's what history says. That's why Canada kept it a crime.
And we are keeping it a crime.
No, an infraction, it's a ticket, it's a fine, there's no court hearing. How are you going to enforce it? That's my question.
Well, how are we enforcing it right now?
Well, that's not my issue. That's Utah's problem. Utah's the one not enforcing the law. There's a current law right now, and Utah's not enforcing the law. I'll give you a prime example. Nicole Van Tassel is sitting here in the room. Many of you know her father. If you knew her whole story, it's terrible what happened to her. She was manipulated into polygamy. She grew up in a good LDS home, marries him, then he tells her, "You're going to find me another wife?" And it wasn't even allowed to be mentioned in the courtroom during her case. We will not mention the word polygamy in the courtroom. I suggest we start enforcing the law. But the way you do that isn't by going into individual families. When you realize this is organized crime, that's a different story. You need to look at the leaders of these individual groups. That's what I would suggest. And we have a perfect example right now in another courtroom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kelley.